Hey everybody, welcome back and welcome to our second video in the series on conservation. Now, those of us that have kept animals for any length of time have heard at some point or another you shouldn't keep those animals in captivity, they're better off in the wild. Now this brings up a really important question. Are these animals really better off in the wild? Today we're going to look at some of the pressures that are on animals in their natural habitats. We're going to look at some that are on the brink of extinction, some of the reasons why, simply to build awareness and build on the understanding that keeping animals in captivity, breeding them in captivity, is not always a bad thing. Sometimes it can save an entire species. So we got a lot of important things to touch on today on Intrepid Exotics. Whether you're a lifelong keeper or just getting started, help us encourage responsible keeping, conservation, and public education in the interest of keeping our reptiles safe and healthy as we protect them for future generations. You're invited to spend time with us as we experience these awesome animals together on Intrepid Exotics. Now this is a really important topic for everybody to pay attention to, whether we keep animals or whether we don't think that any of these animals should be in captivity to begin with. This is all really important information. Now for those of you guys that missed the initial video on this, I'll put the link right here. You may want to go check that out and then come back. It kind of puts this conversation in perspective a little bit and really kind of drives home the importance of why we're talking about this in the first place. Now this is not going to be comprehensive. It's not going to have every fact, figure, and scientific explanation in it. This is something that we've all got to independently look at and research on our own and learn about. But by way of a quick overview, right now we've got nearly 10,000 species of animals that are critically endangered and on the brink of extinction. There's thousands more that are listed as threatened or endangered, and there's several reasons for that we really need to pay attention to. Now when we talk about stressors that are being applied to these different species of animals that are pushing so many of them to the brink of extinction, there's a lot of subcategories that we can talk about, but the root cause in many cases is simply human beings. Now we're going to affect everything else on the planet either directly or indirectly. We typically associate direct impacts with things like overexploitation, where we're hunting wild animals for meat, where the population's already stressed. We're overhunting, overfishing, things of that nature. And there's also, hunting for trinkets. We're talking about people that are killing elephants for their tusks, killing rhinos for their horns, killing sharks for their fins, whaling. All of these different human activities that are done for profit with no respect to how the population is doing. It's already had such a massive impact. I've actually got a video that I put out not long ago about reticulated python hunting over in Indonesia, and you can check that out up there. It's really sad to see some of the harvesting practices that we do, not only on snakes and whales and any other animal that you can think of that we can make a buck off of. But we couple that with the human expansion, which starts moving into habitat loss. You think about all of the complications with going in, building a new subdivision in an area. You're getting humans closer to animals that, in many cases, people may be frankly terrified of. You're moving into habitats of things like leopards and bears. In parts of the world, you're moving into the habitats of mountain gorillas. I mean, how many of you would really feel comfortable and safe if you knew you couldn't walk out into the woods or through your local greenway without getting jumped on by a jaguar or having a big silverback gorilla prowling around out there? We completely forget about respecting those animals in their habitat when it comes to our own safety. So, killing these animals strictly out of fear is a big problem as well. And the more our habitat expands, the more communities we build, the further we reach in, the less they've got available to live in. And of course, the more that happens, the more our paths cross. So, our need to expand in order to grow our own species really cuts in on so many different levels to all of the other ones. And the more people there are, the more pollution there is, the more refuse and trash. Some places you may not see it a whole lot because you've got really modern trash collection systems, but there's places in this world that don't have that are completely littered. Streams full of garbage and debris. It's so common to see birds and sea life that's either ingested plastics and it's killed them, or they get wrapped up in refuse and they can't get out of it. Even abandoned gill nets and things like that. All are really terrible for the ecosystem and end up putting so many of these animals in jeopardy when we're already stressing them with everything else. A lot of the other things that are impacting these guys are climate related. Now, whether you believe it or not is a non-issue. Climate change is a scientifically proven fact. There's no question in the scientific community whatsoever. The only reason why there's any kickback on it is because there's people that make money off of things that are harmful to the environment. It's always been that way. It likely will always be that way. But it's a reality that we've got to acknowledge. So many different habitats have been affected by this already. We're talking about coral reefs that are dying off. 75% of the coral reefs are dying off because sea temperatures are warming and it's causing bleaching within the corals and it's killing them off. And this is such a base in the food chain for the entire ocean ecosystem. One major impact that a raising sea temperature is having. Another thing is you're seeing areas of increased drought that are drier, that are more prone to wildfires, which is killing off the animals directly, destroying their habitats, destroying their dens and their food sources. Areas that are being more prone to floods, of course, on the other side of the coin. This is a very destructive, really destructive to all of their habitats as well. Another thing that people may or may not think a whole lot about, you see it on the news every now and then, but is disease. When we're talking about human beings, the scientific community has said for years that the greatest threat to humanity is a disease. They don't know what it's going to be yet, but we all saw this with COVID, where something starts to get out of control and it turns our entire world upside down. Think about something like rabies, for instance. Rabies right now is transmitted through saliva. Just imagine if a disease like rabies that's 100% fatal once you show symptoms, imagine if that went airborne and it became resistant to vaccines. That would literally be apocalyptic for the entire species of human beings. Animals are impacted by this as well. One thing that, you'll hear a lot of people complaining about the cost of eggs. And they think that's a wholly political thing, not even realizing that bird flu had impacted so many millions of, chicken coops because of, the close quarters and the mass production and all that. You get a case of bird flu in one and it spreads through and you've got millions of animals that now you've got to kill off. And of course, the supply for things like poultry and eggs goes down, so the price goes up. And I know most of us as reptile keepers have heard the phrase invasive species. And most of it is in relation to the Burmese pythons. It's down in Florida. That is definitely a concern. It's a concern to the native wildlife there. But what some people may not know is that Burmese pythons are actually listed as threatened in their natural habitat. Another really good example of a situation caused by an invasive species that was introduced by humans is in relation to the Bermudan red crab. There was a species of heron that was pretty much hunted to extinction by people. When those birds were gone, because their primary food source was the red crab, the crab population exploded to the point where they've got crabs just covering the streets. In an effort to get rid of that, they reintroduced a different species of heron that's really similar to that. And that species of heron went ahead and wiped out that red crab population. The thing is, that abundant food source raise the population of those heron, and as that food source diminished, they had to find other sources of food. So instead of just having the crabs eat, they moved on and they started predating on Bermudan skinks, which is an endangered species. So, humans eliminated one species, brought in another one to rebalance the ecosystem. In the process of doing that, there's 2 other species that are practically eliminated. So it's such a fine line that we run. Some of these things, we can try and fix them. We can have the best intentions in the world and trying to reintroduce different species and so forth. But sometimes when something's gone, it's gone. And there's nothing sensible that we can really do as far as wild populations go. And this is a good example of that. There's a catch-22 that there just wasn't a good answer for it. Now, some of the species that are directly impacted that are really at risk for any number of reasons that we've just talked about. A big one, like I said, is corals. There are marine biologists right now that are doing their level best to salvage different species of corals and farm them and reintroduce them because, like I said, ocean temperatures are rising so high that it's bleaching them off. They die shortly thereafter, and it's such an important base of the food chain in the ocean. It's really important that these are maintained in any way that we can. Many of you may have heard about the polar bear situation. The last number that I seen, it was like 30,000 polar bears left. But the problem is as the sea ice in their habitats melts, and they start to lose access to their natural food sources, are being driven onto dry land. And there's so many of them right now. They're one example after another of seeing these bears emaciated and not being able to sustain themselves, again, as a result of the warming climate, and essentially their habitat is melting. Sea turtles are another one that's really well publicized. A lot of different governments have protected these animals, but because of the pollution and the changes in the climate and changes in the ocean, 6 out of 7 sea turtle species are listed as endangered. Asian elephant populations are in trouble as well. Not only because there's places where they're experiencing drought and a lack of food, they're also being hunted for their ivory. Animals like tigers, whose habitats are being cut down and they're being killed for their skins, or being killed because, for retaliatory situations where this tiger may have attacked somebody and the whole village goes out and hunts them. It's another side effect of us commingling and expanding and getting into their natural habitats, and those animals almost always lose. Animals like chimpanzees, who there's 4 countries right now where they are completely extinct in. They don't live in those countries anymore. And the populations that are still existing, again, there's cultures that hunt these animals for their meat. They call it bushmeat. And that's threatening whatever populations of those that are left. The Amur leopards are another species that's really close. And you may not think about it, but there's a lot of species of sharks that are endangered. Not only because of, fishing them for their fins, for their trinkets and so forth, but there's a lot of unintentional deaths of these because of commercial fishing, where they end up getting caught up in the nets and dying. We're all familiar with the overwhaling situation. And another species that's really at risk, that's lost 60% of its population so far, is mountain gorillas. Again, as human populations start encroaching on their habitat, how many of you are going to let your 10-year-old kid go play in the woods like we always used to do when we was kids, if you've got to worry about a silverback gorilla prowling around and picking them up and throwing them across the woods? Of course they're not. If they're a threat to humans, they're going to lose. And unfortunately, if we don't set aside areas for these animals to live in, where they're not touched, where people aren't allowed to move into, they're going to be gone completely, simply to make room for us. So just this really brief list right here of 10 examples, that's 10 out of nearly 10,000 that are critically endangered right now because of all of the reasons that we talked about. And it is such a complex web of cause and effect. You know, one species may go extinct, causes another species to overpopulate, which causes another species that they're feeding on to go extinct. And it is such a chaotic roller coaster that we've got to admit, you know, yeah, an untouched wild is a great place for a lot of these animals to stay. But we've got to understand it. So many of these animals are going to go extinct if we don't intervene. Bring some of these animals into captivity, raise them, breed them. A perfect success story that we'll be going into in another video is the crested geckos, who were thought to be extinct for 100 years. They were brought into captivity, and the captive breeding and keeping them as pets has exploded their population, and they're good now. Granted, in their natural habitats they're still threatened, but at least we've got enough of these animals in captivity where we're going to be able to maintain the species. And that applies for a lot of animals where zoos and humans have really gone the extra mile to try and bring them back, to try and breed them and repopulate, and sometimes reintroduce them back into the wild. So there's a lot of different facets to this. So when you say an animal's better off in the wild, in theory, idealistically, that may be true. But there again, we're talking about which animal is it and which habitat are they going back to, because a lot of these simply aren't going to survive. Now again, guys, like I said, this is kind of a food for thought video. There's not enough time or attention span to go into all of the numbers, all the species and so forth. But I really encourage anybody that has any interest at all in keeping animals, whether it be in captivity or keeping them alive in the wild, you know, kind of use this as an outline to go off on your own and start researching some of these things. You know, all you got to do is go out and Google endangered, fill in the species here. There's all kinds of information on what their status is, what the main stressors are that they're dealing with, and what organizations are helping to revive those populations. It's all really important stuff that we need to talk about. It's all part of considering the conservation aspect of keeping our animals. And as we go through this series, we're going to dive really deep into some different aspects. We're going to do a couple more big overviews. But it's really all just food for thought, starting and maintaining the conversation. It's so important for any of us that care about wildlife, especially for myself, being a fledgling wildlife photographer. You know, one of the programs that has made it possible for me to be able to go out and sit by the river and get pictures of these bald eagles is out by Jordan Lake in the 80s. They did a reintroduction where, you know, they started to breed and release bald eagles into this area for the sake of repopulating them. And now we've got a massive population, one of the biggest on the East Coast out here locally. All because of the work that people did in order to save an animal from going extinct. You know, and as, like I said, man, as I'm out there with my camera trying to capture wildlife in its natural state, I think about it all day long. You know, if I would have been out there 100 years ago, how much more would I see? How much more would be there? If I go out there 5 years from now, how many of these species are still going to be there? How many of them are going to be completely gone? It's a lot to think about. It's a lot of food for thought. So I encourage you guys to think with me and to take this seriously. And like I said, kind of use this as a primer to kind of motivate all of us to start learning more about what we can do to help preserve what we've got, because I would really like to see my grandkids be able to go out and have some of the same experiences that I do. So you guys have an outstanding day, and we will see you next time on Intrepid Exotics.